The flashing lights of the police cruisers cut through the night like sharp blades, illuminating the empty street in harsh, flickering bursts. A man in a crisp black suit freezes, his hands raised instinctively, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. "Sir, step out of the car," one officer commands, voice tight with suspicion. The tension hangs thick in the air, almost tangible, like smoke. He steps out slowly, every movement deliberate, his eyes scanning the officers' faces, some hard, some confused. Around him, a small crowd has gathered, whispers spreading like wildfire. "Is that him? He must be wanted for something." The words slice through the night, sharp and judgmental. The man swallows, fighting the rising tide of humiliation. In that moment, he is not seen as a person, but as a suspect, a statistic, a profile, a threat shaped by prejudice and assumptions. "Hands behind your back, now," the officer snaps. His pulse accelerates. He knows the drill, knows the consequences if they're wrong, but the fear is real, immediate, suffocating. The world seems to shrink to the space between himself and the officers, every step a test of patience and composure. He glances briefly at the onlookers, some recording on their phones, others just staring, eyes wide with curiosity or judgment. Nobody sees the man they're dealing with. They see only what they expect to see, and their expectation is danger. Their expectation is fear. Their expectation is him as someone less than. And yet, beneath the tailored suit and calm exterior lies a mind few could ever imagine. A mind that has shaped laws, fought battles in courtrooms, and climbed corridors of power invisible to those blinded by bias. In a heartbeat, the narrative is about to flip, and everything the crowd thinks they know will be wrong. The officer steps closer, hand hovering near his holster, voice tightening. "Do you know why we stopped you?" The man inhales slowly, eyes steady. The answer he gives will shatter every assumption, every whispered rumor, every judgment passed in this street. Tonight, the truth will emerge, and it will leave everyone stunned, because the man they thought was guilty is the Attorney General of the state. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your country and city in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Let's find out where in the world this message lands. Police confrontation. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, heavy and unnatural. The street lamps flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the sidewalk. He was walking briskly, briefcase in hand, a man focused on the last calls of the day, unaware of the eyes watching him from the dark corners of the street. A sudden blare of sirens shattered the silence. Red and blue lights reflected off the asphalt, washing over the parked cars, the walls, and finally, him. His pace faltered. 3 police cruisers screeched to a stop around him, tires squealing, lights spinning like a chaotic carousel. Doors swung open. Officers shouted commands he barely had time to process. "Step out of the car! Hands where we can see them!" He froze. The world contracted to the space between him and the officers, every movement suddenly under a microscope of suspicion. His mind raced. He knew the law, knew procedure, knew how dangerous misunderstandings could become, but this wasn't a courtroom. This was the street. This was perception, judgment, and fear colliding. The officers approached with a careful precision, their hands near their holsters, eyes scanning for threats. One of them barked again, "Don't make any sudden moves! Now!" His hand went to his chest, adjusting the jacket, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could see the onlookers gathering at a distance, their phones raised, capturing every motion. Whispered judgments spread like wildfire. "He looks like someone wanted. What's he hiding? Should we call backup?" Their expectations were shaping reality, turning suspicion into conviction before any facts had been established. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, palms outward. "I'm not a threat," he said, voice steady but low, every word measured. Inside, though, his mind was a storm, calculating, anticipating, weighing every possible reaction. One wrong move, one misread signal, and the evening could turn catastrophic. The lead officer stepped closer, voice sharp, eyes cold. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You are a suspect. Don't resist." He blinked. Warrant? Suspect? A surge of indignation rose, quickly tempered by years of discipline, education, and patience. He exhaled slowly, heart still racing, aware that nothing he said could immediately change their perception. And yet, behind the suit, behind the calm demeanor, there was power, knowledge, and authority no one there could imagine. Tonight, Judgment had been passed before the facts were known, and tonight the streets were about to witness a truth that would turn disbelief into awe, a revelation that no one in that circle of flashing lights could possibly anticipate. Protagonist's reaction. He froze in the middle of the street, heart hammering like a drum echoing through his chest. The sudden flurry of police activity had thrown him into a whirlwind of disbelief. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Warrant, arrest, suspect, none of it made sense. He had committed no crime, nothing. And yet, here he was, surrounded by officers pointing weapons, flashing lights painting his suit in harsh red and blue tones. A cold wave of fear washed over him. He felt the weight of every eye on him, the officers scrutinizing his every movement, the onlookers whispering, cameras raised, capturing the scene in real time. Was this really happening? Could a single mistake, a misread signal, or a hasty assumption destroy everything he had worked for? His hands trembled slightly as he raised them, palms out, a universal gesture of surrender. He wanted to speak, to explain, to plead his case, but the words tangled in his throat. The fear was primal, visceral, the kind that claws at your chest and steals your breath. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to protect himself, yet logic reminded him, one wrong step, one reaction interpreted as defiance, and things could escalate beyond control. Confusion gnawed at him. How could they think this? He had spent years building a life, a career, a reputation. Every achievement had been hard-earned, every step deliberate. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. He was reduced to a stereotype, a silhouette of fear projected by others' assumptions. Indignation surged next, hot and sharp. How dare they? How dare anyone decide his guilt before even knowing his name, his story, his life? He felt the sting of humiliation as whispers rippled through the crowd. There he is! Must be dangerous. Every word, every glance pressed down on him, a reminder that society's judgment often arrives before truth. And yet, beneath the storm of fear and anger, he steadied himself. He inhaled deeply, forcing calm into his trembling body. He could not let the moment dictate him. He had to navigate it with the same precision that had guided his career. Every move had to be deliberate, measured, controlled. As the officers closed in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning, he met their gaze steadily, masking the chaos within. The crowd held its breath. Phones clicked, whispers hushed. He was the calm eye in the storm, a man whose intellect and authority remained invisible to those blinded by assumptions. In that suspended moment, he understood the full weight of prejudice, the fragility of perception, and the sharp contrast between appearance and reality. And somewhere deep inside, he knew, though they saw only a man to be judged, a threat to be subdued, his life, his mind, and his power contained a truth they could not yet imagine. Perfeito. Aqui está o bloco 3, focando no comentário do policial, com suspeita baseada em aparência ou informações erradas, mantendo suspense e narrativa cinematográfica, cerca de 450 palavras. Officer's suspicion. The lead officer stepped closer, his boots crunching against the uneven asphalt, eyes sharp and unyielding. His voice carried authority, edged with a tension that made the hairs on the back of the man's neck stand on end. "Sir," he began, each word deliberate, measured, "we have reason to believe you are wanted for questioning. You match the description of a suspect in a recent investigation." The words hit like a shockwave. Wanted for questioning? Investigation. His mind refused to catch up with the absurdity of it. He had walked these streets countless times, navigated meetings, offices, hallways of power, and now he was being accused, judged, based on what exactly? A profile? A hasty report? A fleeting resemblance? The officer didn't pause, his gaze scanning from the man's face down to his tailored suit, noting details that seemed off to him, suspicious. "We've had multiple reports," he continued, voice firm, "of someone matching your appearance in connection with illegal activities. Now step aside and cooperate." The man's chest tightened. Every syllable was a dagger of misunderstanding, every glance a verdict passed without evidence. He could see the tension in the officer's hands, hovering near holsters, fingers twitching as though the slightest misstep could confirm their assumptions. The crowd's whispers intensified, feeding on the officer's words. "He's the one. Looks just like the guy. Better stay back." Inside him, a mix of incredulity and indignation surged. How could they reduce a person's life, achievements, identity, and intellect to a shadow drawn from guesswork and bias. It was not merely an error, it was the raw manifestation of prejudice, the kind that can shape reality with nothing more than an assumption and a description. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the officer cut him off. "Sir, we are not here to argue. Any sudden movements and you will be treated as a threat. Now comply." The words were calm, but the menace underneath was unmistakable. The tension became almost tactile, wrapping around him like iron chains, binding him in the public gaze of judgment and expectation. The man swallowed, anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted them to see him, really see him, not the figure drawn from a mistaken report, not the suspect conjured from bias, but the person behind the uniformed assumptions. Yet he realized quickly that nothing he could say or do in this moment would pierce the veil of misperception, and so he stood still, measured, composed, eyes locked on the officer, waiting for the storm to pass, all the while knowing the truth that no one here could yet imagine. In that street, under the flashing red and blue lights, the gap between appearance and reality had never felt more cruel, and the irony of what was about to unfold would soon shatter every assumption in the air. Protagonist's background. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the streets whispered caution and the walls bore the weight of countless stories like his own. The son of a single mother, he had learned early that life did not distribute opportunities equally. Every day was a negotiation with circumstance, every step forward a challenge against a tide that seemed determined to push him back. Being black in a society that often judged before it understood added another layer of difficulty, a constant reminder that perception often carried more weight than reality. School was both refuge and battlefield. He remembered the narrow, worn hallways of his local public school, where whispers and stares followed him like shadows. Teachers occasionally overlooked his questions, classmates dismissed his ideas, and the system seemed designed to encourage mediocrity rather than brilliance. Yet even then he refused to bow to expectation. Books became his armor, education his shield. He devoured knowledge relentlessly, immersing himself in history, science, and law, constructing a mind sharper than any prejudice could blunt. Financial hardship was a daily companion. There were days when the electricity flickered and dinner was delayed, moments that could have embittered him, but instead forged resilience. He worked odd jobs, often while balancing late-night studies, understanding that every small sacrifice was a brick in the foundation of a future he could barely imagine but refused to relinquish. Poverty, he realized, was not a cage. It was a test of endurance and vision. Beyond the material struggles, he faced the subtle, corrosive challenges of racial bias. Doors that should have opened remained shut. Opportunities were delayed or denied, often with excuses that veiled the underlying discrimination. Each encounter reinforced a truth he could not ignore. The world would rarely recognize his worth without evidence too undeniable to ignore. And so he prepared, strategically, meticulously, relentlessly, arming himself with qualifications, skills, and experiences that no stereotype could ever diminish. By the time he reached adulthood, he had transformed adversity into fuel. Scholarships, internships, mentorships all became stepping stones across a river that seemed impossible to cross. Each challenge he overcame added weight to his determination, shaping a man who was both aware of society's flaws and equipped to navigate, challenge, and ultimately transform them. In the shadows of doubt cast by others, he developed an unshakable self-belief. The streets that had once echoed with whispers of judgment now stood as silent witnesses to the making of a man destined for authority, influence, and a confrontation with society's assumptions that would leave onlookers stunned. What no one could see then, his intellect, his discipline, his vision, would soon explode into clarity in a moment no one in that street would ever forget. Career and quiet achievements years had passed since the narrow streets of his childhood, but the lessons he learned there had not faded, they had only sharpened. Today, he walked through polished corridors, a man of quiet authority and subtle influence. His tailored suit and composed demeanor suggested professionalism, but beneath the surface lay a record of achievements few could imagine, accomplishments that spoke louder than any stereotype ever could. He had climbed the ranks in the legal world with precision, not spectacle. Positions that required intellect, strategy, and discretion became his domain. Colleagues often underestimated him, seeing only the color of his skin, never the depth of his expertise. But his work quietly reshaped policies, influenced court decisions, and built networks of trust among those who recognized talent over appearances. He was not seeking applause, he was laying foundations, one calculated move at a time. Discreet recognition followed him. Awards, commendations, and letters of acknowledgement accumulated in folders tucked away in offices, unseen by the casual observer. To those who judged him on the surface, he appeared ordinary. Yet he had authored critical legal frameworks, crafted complex strategies that impacted thousands, and advised officials on decisions that would reverberate through entire states. The authority he wielded was invisible, intangible to anyone relying on superficial judgment, but its effects were undeniable. Even in social settings, his presence commanded subtle respect. Conversations pivoted when he spoke, arguments shifted in his favor without fanfare, and decisions once stalled suddenly found direction under his insight. He moved through the world like a shadow with substance, silent, unnoticed, but indispensable. Those who knew the real him, even in small circles, recognized a mind honed for precision, strategy, and change. Yet, outside those circles, he remained invisible to the world's prejudices. On the streets, in public spaces, he was just another man walking, judged on appearances, assumptions, and biases. The irony was almost cruel. The very skills and intelligence that made him formidable were the ones the world refused to see in him. It was a paradox he had learned to navigate. The more extraordinary his accomplishments, the more invisible he could be to those blinded by stereotype. And now, standing in the glow of police sirens, that invisible power, that quiet mastery of law and authority, was about to collide violently with society's assumptions. The man they presumed to be ordinary, or worse, guilty, was anything but. Every achievement, every discreet victory, every quiet triumph had led to this moment. Soon the world would realize the truth hidden in plain sight, and the disparity between perception and reality would become undeniable. Subtle clues of hidden authority. Even in the harsh glow of the police lights, he carried himself with a composure that few could mistake. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, movements measured, not the twitchy, nervous demeanor of someone guilty, but the calm, deliberate control of a man accustomed to command. There was a rhythm to the way he stood, a silent assertion of presence that demanded attention without a word. His eyes, calm and observant, scanned the officers, the crowd, the environment, absorbing every detail. He noticed small inconsistencies, the hesitancy in one officer's step, the shifting weight of another, the subtle whispers of those recording the scene. While others reacted impulsively, his mind analyzed, calculated, anticipated. Every gesture he made was precise, a language of authority spoken without speaking. Even in silence, he communicated control. There were moments, small, fleeting, that hinted at a life beyond the assumptions of the onlookers. When he tilted his head, it was with the poise of someone used to reading people, gauging their intentions, predicting their reactions. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, measured yet persuasive, each word chosen as if it carried legal weight, as if it could bend decisions simply by being articulated. It was a cadence learned over years in courtrooms, boardrooms, and offices where precision was power. The officers, however, unaware of the depth before them, interpreted his calm as either defiance or detachment. They did not yet see the subtle authority that radiated from him, one born not from intimidation, but from mastery of knowledge, experience, and human behavior. Every subtle nod, every controlled breath, every deliberate movement was a testament to a mind that had shaped law, influenced decisions, and commanded respect in arenas invisible to the casual observer. Even the crowd, caught in a haze of flashing lights and uncertainty, sensed a difference, something almost intangible. There was a weight to his presence that could not be explained, a quiet magnetism that made even skeptics hesitate, even briefly. For those attuned to it, these were clues that this was not a man ordinary or easily dismissed. There was power hidden in plain sight, authority invisible to those blinded by superficial judgment, and yet he offered no explanation, no boastful reveal. The hints were subtle, almost imperceptible, waiting for the right moment to be understood. Each gesture, each carefully controlled expression, was a breadcrumb leading to a truth the world was not yet ready to see. In that tension-soaked street, under the flashing red and blue lights, the stage was being set. Soon, the discrepancy between appearance and reality would explode, shattering assumptions, challenging prejudice, and revealing the extraordinary man standing silently in the center of it all. Public humiliation and dramatic tension. The lead officer's gaze hardened as he stepped even closer, the night alive with the staccato rhythm of flashing sirens. "Hands on your head! Step forward!" he barked, each word amplified by adrenaline and authority. The man complied slowly, deliberately, aware of every whisper, every judgmental glance from the gathering crowd. Every step felt like a spotlight shining on his supposed guilt, every motion magnified by 1,000 eyes. Whispers and murmurs swelled among the onlookers. Phones were raised, cameras focused, strangers capturing what they assumed would be evidence of wrongdoing. "That's him, right?" one voice asked. "Looks just like the description," another said. The crowd's assumptions wrapped around him like chains, binding him in a moment of collective misjudgment. The humiliation was immediate, sharp, and relentless. The officers were tense, hands hovering near holsters, ready for the slightest provocation. Each command was strict, mechanical. "Don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them, face down." He followed, each instruction executed with precision, but the sting of indignity pressed against him. He felt the weight of every eye judging him, assuming guilt without proof, letting fear and bias dictate reality. Inside, a storm raged. Anger, disbelief, and frustration collided with the necessity for calm. He knew that any outburst, any visible impatience could be used against him, escalating a situation that had already tipped dangerously. Yet, in that exact restraint, there was power, a quiet resistance that demanded recognition, even if no one yet understood why. The officers moved to cuff him, and the crowd gasped audibly. A few muttered criticisms, some expressed worry, and others sneered, feeding into the spectacle. Every step he took toward compliance felt like a public stripping of dignity, a performance forced upon him by the prejudices of others. The absurdity of the moment, the realization that he was a man of influence, authority, and intellect, now reduced to a suspect in the eyes of strangers, was almost unbearable. But beneath the humiliation, a clarity emerged. He observed the scene like a strategist, positioning of officers, reactions of the crowd, timing of commands. His mind catalogued each detail, anticipating the moves and errors of those around him. While the world saw a man cornered, powerless, and shamed, inside, he remained unbroken, calculating, poised for the revelation that would overturn every assumption made about him. The flashing lights, the whispers, the tension, they were all part of a narrative they thought they controlled. Little did they know, the truth about this man's authority, intellect, and influence was about to explode in their faces, exposing the disparity between appearance and reality in the most dramatic way imaginable. Public reaction, comments, glances, and hasty judgments. The crowd had grown thicker, forming a semicircle around the unfolding drama. Phones were raised, lenses zoomed, whispers spreading like wildfire. Every flick of a finger, every subtle movement was recorded, analyzed, and instantly judged. People speculated openly, their words sharp and unfiltered. "He must have done something," one muttered, voice low but certain. "Why else would the police act like this?" another asked, eyebrows furrowed with suspicion. Eyes darted between the man and the officers, scanning for signs of guilt. Some stared in curiosity, some with fear, and others with thinly veiled disdain. In that instant, the crowd became a jury, judging not the actions or facts, but the appearance, the posture, the color of his skin, the way he carried himself. He felt their gazes like 1,000 invisible hands pressing down on his shoulders, each glance reinforcing a narrative that wasn't true. A few spectators whispered to one another, pointing discreetly. "That's the one from the neighborhood. I think I saw him near the scene." The assumptions piled up, feeding on the spectacle. None of them knew the truth. None had a single piece of verified information, and yet certainty radiated from their murmurs, a dangerous conviction born of habit and bias rather than fact. The man could feel the tension coiling tighter around him. Some onlookers tried to rationalize the scene. Maybe he really was guilty. Maybe the police had reasons they couldn't reveal. But for many, the assumption was immediate, automatic. In mere moments, he had been transformed in their minds from a professional, educated man into a criminal defined by fear, color, and circumstance. Whispers grew bolder. A teenager snapped a picture, uploading it instantly, captioning it with a question that implied guilt. Comments and notifications would soon follow, shaping opinions before any truth could intervene. Their judgments were loud, careless, and relentless, a storm of misunderstanding amplified by modern technology and human prejudice. And yet, amid the murmurs and assumptions, subtle signs of hesitation appeared. A few observant eyes noted his calm demeanor, his precise movements, the lack of panic. They sensed something incongruous, a mismatch between what they expected and what they saw. But in a sea of judgments, these glimpses were drowned, like small ripples in a stormy ocean. In that moment, society's gaze was both suffocating and illuminating. It revealed the cruelty of assumptions, the speed with which perception overrides fact, and the fragility of reputation in the eyes of strangers. The man stood in the center, a silent witness to their prejudice, absorbing every glance, every whisper, and every hasty conclusion. He was judged, misinterpreted, and humiliated, but he was far from powerless. Beneath the flashing lights and the murmurs, a quiet truth persisted. The world was about to learn in the most dramatic way possible that perception is not reality, and that appearances can be devastatingly deceptive. Internal reflection, indignation, patience, and self-control. He stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by flashing lights, murmuring onlookers and officers who assumed guilt before knowing a single fact. The weight of injustice pressed against him like a physical force, and yet, beneath it all, his mind remained sharp, analyzing, measuring, observing. Indignation simmered, hot and relentless, a fire fueled by years of prejudice, misunderstanding, and societal bias. How dare they? How dare anyone assume his guilt based on appearance alone, without a shred of evidence, without even a name? But alongside the anger, patience emerged as a quiet companion. He had learned long ago that reactions in the heat of the moment could become weapons against oneself. Impulse could turn logic into chaos, clarity into misperception. Every instance of prejudice, every unfair judgment was a test, not of his power, but of his composure. He inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of his heart, grounding himself in a discipline that had been forged over years of struggle, education, and quiet triumph. Auto-control, he realized, was not merely restraint. It was power. It was the ability to navigate chaos with calm precision, to turn assumptions and bias into a stage for revelation rather than conflict. He observed the officers' movements, the whispers of the crowd, the flickering lights, cataloging every detail. His mind raced faster than his heart, anticipating each potential escalation, each misstep, each fleeting judgment. He did not panic. He did not protest. He remained the eye of the storm, steady, measured, unshaken. The indignation he felt was not destructive. It was a source of clarity. It reminded him of the stakes, of the irony of the situation, and of the contrast between appearance and reality. The world saw only what it wanted to see: a man in a suit, a suspect, a figure defined by assumptions. They could not see the years of struggle, the intellect honed in classrooms and courtrooms, the quiet victories that had shaped him into someone whose authority could not be questioned once revealed. He allowed the crowd, the whispers, and the flashing lights to wash over him, absorbing the unfairness without letting it dictate his actions. Each moment of composure became a silent declaration. He would not allow the ignorance of others to define him. Every word he would speak, every movement he would make would be deliberate, leading to a revelation that would shatter assumptions and demand recognition, not of their judgment, but of his truth. In that tense, suspended moment, the man understood something profound. Patience, discipline, and self-control were his greatest allies. The world could misjudge him, humiliate him, and misunderstand him, but the truth, when revealed, would speak louder than any prejudice ever could. Historical and social context, racial prejudice and stereotypes. To understand the moment unfolding on that street, one had to look beyond the flashing lights and murmuring crowd to the long history that had shaped their assumptions. Prejudice is rarely spontaneous. It is woven into the fabric of society, a legacy of centuries of systemic bias, exclusion, and misunderstanding. The assumptions cast upon him, the suspicion, the hasty judgments, the instant labeling, were not anomalies. They were echoes of patterns ingrained over generations. Racial bias has always shaped perception. Black men in particular have often been judged by appearance before action, criminalized for identity rather than behavior, reduced to stereotypes that oversimplify complexity. These patterns are reinforced not only by law enforcement, but also by media, social narratives, and cultural norms that repeatedly portray certain communities as threats, regardless of reality. In this context, His presence on that street was filtered through a lens shaped by history, a lens that magnified danger where there was none and ignored merit where it existed. Stereotypes are powerful because they are invisible and assumed. They influence reactions subtly, shaping micro-decisions and split-second judgments. Officers acted on them without awareness. The crowd echoed them instinctively. The man in the suit was caught in a web spun long before that night, a web of cultural expectation and systemic oversight. His achievements, education, and authority were invisible to a society conditioned to see only certain narratives. Yet this historical and social backdrop also highlights a striking contrast. While bias creates barriers, it cannot erase individual resilience, intelligence, or accomplishment. It amplifies the drama of moments like these, making the eventual revelation, the truth of who he is, resonant not just as a personal victory, but as a challenge to society's assumptions. His story is an intersection of personal perseverance and systemic critique, a reminder that reality is far more nuanced than any stereotype could capture. The irony is profound. The very biases that sought to diminish him now set the stage for recognition. Every glance filled with doubt, every whisper questioning his presence, is a testament to the power of preconceived notions. Yet, these assumptions also heighten the eventual impact of truth. When the disparity between perception and reality is revealed, it strikes harder precisely because it contradicts centuries of conditioned thinking. On that street, under flashing lights and watchful eyes, history and society converged. The man standing silently was both a victim of bias and a symbol of defiance against it. Every moment of prejudice surrounding him only amplified the significance of the revelation to come, a revelation that would force observers to confront not just his identity, but their own assumptions and the larger societal patterns that shape them, reinforcing injustice and inequality. The crowd, the flashing lights, the tense officers, all of it was a microcosm of a larger truth. Across history, countless examples demonstrate how society often judges before it understands, punishes before it investigates, and marginalizes based on appearance or circumstance. Studies have repeatedly shown that Black individuals are disproportionately stopped, questioned, and perceived as threats in public spaces, regardless of behavior or intent. The statistics were stark. According to research by the Center for Policing Equity, Black Americans are more than twice as likely to be stopped by police compared to white Americans, even when controlling for location and behavior. He had lived these numbers in flesh and experience. Each interaction, each assumption, each whisper of doubt had been backed by generations of systemic bias. From housing discrimination to unequal educational opportunities, from underrepresentation in positions of power to the overrepresentation in arrest records, the patterns were clear. His presence on the street, mistaken for a criminal by strangers and officers alike, was a direct reflection of that enduring inequality. Historical voices echoed his experience. James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Each glance filled with suspicion, every whispered judgment, was a reminder of what Baldwin described, the persistent reality of facing prejudice before change could be imagined. Similarly, Michelle Alexander, in The New Jim Crow, highlighted how systemic structures continue to enforce racial disparities, especially in policing and justice. The scene unfolding now was a small-scale reenactment of these patterns, a modern reflection of enduring injustice. Even ordinary encounters reveal the bias embedded in society. Studies show that Black men are more likely to be perceived as older, more threatening, and less innocent than their white peers, a phenomenon often referred to as adultification bias. In this instant, the protagonist was not simply a man. He had been transformed into a symbol of threat in the minds of the public and authorities, a perception rooted not in facts, but in prejudice. And yet, the irony of this moment was profound. The same assumptions that sought to diminish him, that treated him as lesser, were about to be confronted by reality. Each misjudgment, each whisper of doubt, each judgmental glance was setting the stage for a revelation that would expose not only the truth about him, but also the fragility of societal assumptions. Injustice had created tension, but it had also primed the world for awakening. In that suspended moment, under the weight of bias and the scrutiny of the crowd, the disparity between perception and reality was painfully clear, and the audience, both on the street and watching in their minds, was about to witness a truth that would challenge every assumption, every stereotype, and every deeply held prejudice that had led to this scene. Public empathy, emotional connection with the protagonist. Among the murmurs and judgments, a few faces in the crowd began to shift. The initial assumptions, fueled by bias and fear, were starting to crack under the subtle cues that this man was unlike the criminalized image projected onto him. A mother clutching her child glanced more closely at his measured movements, the calm in his eyes, and the way he followed the officer's commands without panic. She could sense restraint, patience, and dignity, the very qualities she hoped her own children would develop. A young man leaning against a street lamp furrowed his brow in thought. Something about the way he spoke, the deliberate precision of his movements, seemed familiar, not threatening, but authoritative in a quiet, almost invisible way. He began to question his own assumptions, the instant judgments he had made, and a pang of guilt crept in. "What if they're wrong?" he whispered to a friend, who nodded hesitantly, sensing the same contradiction. Even strangers who had initially assumed guilt started to notice small signs of humanity. A teen filming the scene paused, lowering the phone slightly, capturing not a criminal, but a man who radiated composure in the face of humiliation. Whispers of doubt replaced whispers of accusation. "Look at him. He's not scared," one woman said, her voice barely audible over the sirens. "He's calm, so calm." The word calm spread quietly through the crowd, a fragile bridge between suspicion and empathy. Parents exchanged glances, thinking of the unfair judgments that could be made against their own children, and children in the crowd mimicked the protagonist's posture unconsciously, recognizing a hero in stillness rather than force. For a moment, the spectacle shifted. The narrative was no longer purely one of bias and authority. It became a story of resilience, of dignity under pressure. People began to imagine the years of struggle, the battles fought behind closed doors, and the silent victories that had led him here. Empathy, once rare, began to bloom. Eyes softened, voices dropped in tone, and a few people murmured supportive words. "He doesn't deserve this. They're mistaken. Look how composed he is." Each gesture, each shift in perception, created a subtle energy, a collective acknowledgement of humanity amidst misunderstanding. The audience, once complicit in prejudice, began to connect with the protagonist emotionally, sensing a story of struggle, endurance, and integrity unfolding before them. Even in the chaos, this shared empathy planted the seeds for recognition. The crowd was no longer merely witnesses of injustice. They were participants in a narrative that questioned assumptions, challenged bias, and highlighted the human capacity to observe, feel, and ultimately understand. The protagonist, through silence, calm, and unwavering dignity, had begun to transform the very lens through which the world viewed him. Gradual revelation of professional competence and achievements. The tension in the street remained taut, officers still wary, crowd still murmuring, yet subtle signals began to emerge. Gestures, expressions, and statements that hinted at a reality far different from the assumptions surrounding him. It started with the way he spoke, calm and deliberate. Each word chosen not merely to comply but to convey clarity and command. Even in the face of accusation, he articulated points with precision, referencing protocols, legal nuances, and facts in a manner that suggested more than ordinary knowledge. One officer shifted uneasily. He knows the procedures better than we expected," muttered another under his breath. Though the words were whispered, they carried across the crowd, prompting curious glances. Observers began to notice how he corrected minor misunderstandings without arrogance, offering insight that suggested a depth of experience few could match. It was not defiance, it was competence, quiet yet undeniable, demanding acknowledgement without demanding it loudly. The whispers among the crowd evolved. "He's educated," one woman murmured. "Look at how precise he is," added a man, adjusting his stance, suddenly attentive to details he had previously ignored. The narrative was shifting subtly. Suspicion was giving way to curiosity, doubt to recognition. Observers began to sense that this man had not stumbled into trouble by accident. He had navigated life with strategy, intelligence, and skill, and now, even in this precarious moment, those qualities were revealing themselves. More hints followed. His explanations of procedural expectations, his references to legal frameworks, and the calm authority in his demeanor suggested someone accustomed to responsibility far beyond the ordinary. He corrected assumptions made by the police without a trace of aggression, his words carrying weight and credibility that could not be dismissed. The crowd, slowly absorbing these cues, began to reframe their perception. He was no criminal, no ordinary man. They glimpsed a figure who had quietly shaped policies, influenced decisions, and commanded respect in arenas invisible to them. Even small gestures reinforced the revelation. The measured nods, the precise steps, the careful attention to every action communicated mastery over his environment. He did not need to declare his accomplishments. They were evident in the way he carried himself, in the reactions of those trained to recognize authority. Slowly, the assumptions that had driven suspicion and humiliation began to crumble, replaced by an awareness of the gap between perception and reality. In that street, amidst the flashing lights and murmuring crowd, the first threads of recognition took hold. The protagonist's life, years of study, professional triumphs, and discreet but profound influence was beginning to surface. Observers could sense that what they had assumed was danger, incompetence, or guilt was actually intelligence, experience, and extraordinary capability. The slow revelation set the stage for a complete overturning of expectations, a dramatic contrast that would soon become impossible to ignore. Studies, challenges, and unnoticed achievements. As the officers hesitated, unsure how to process the calm, measured authority before them, the protagonist's mind drifted backward through years of silent struggle and tireless effort. He remembered late nights hunched over textbooks in a cramped apartment, the hum of a single lamp illuminating pages filled with law, science, and history. While others slept or wasted time, he had devoted himself to mastering concepts that would one day set him apart, quietly building a foundation of knowledge no one in the streets or offices would notice. He recalled being underestimated at every turn, teachers who dismissed his questions, peers who ignored his contributions, colleagues who assumed his presence was incidental rather than earned. Each slight, each moment of underestimation had become a spark for determination. He pushed harder, studied longer, and refined his skills in silence, knowing that recognition was a luxury and success required patience beyond what most imagined. Scholarships and awards were claimed with humility, almost invisible to the wider world. Each accolade, each academic or professional recognition was quietly celebrated alone, a private triumph against a society conditioned to overlook him. He remembered the first time his research influenced a policy discussion, unseen by the public, acknowledged only by a few mentors who understood the significance. Each success, no matter how impactful, had been a whisper in a world attuned to noise. The flashbacks shifted to moments of personal growth, nights spent volunteering in underserved communities, mentoring younger students, navigating systemic obstacles to education, all while managing financial hardship. He learned to negotiate both the limitations imposed by society and the internal pressure to excel. Every challenge had been a lesson in resilience, every setback an opportunity to refine strategy. He remembered the subtle victories, the papers published under his name in professional journals, the complex cases he solved behind the scenes, the networks of influence he built without fanfare. These were not the achievements that appeared on headlines or social media. They were victories that demanded intellect, patience, and precision. To the world, he was invisible, a figure defined by assumptions. But in his own mind, each accomplishment was a brick in a foundation of competence that no bias could erase. As the present moment pressed down, the flashing lights, the murmurs, the officers' scrutiny, these memories anchored him. The years of unseen effort, the quiet mastery of law and strategy, reminded him that appearance had never defined him, and that the truth, though invisible now, carried power far beyond the assumptions of those around him. The foundation of his life was solid, built on challenges overcome and victories unnoticed, but all of it would soon converge in the moment that mattered most. Subtle signs of something greater, foreshadowing. The night air was thick with tension, but beneath the surface of the street drama, subtle shifts began to hint that this encounter was far from ordinary. Observers, both officers and bystanders, felt a strange dissonance, tiny irregularities that did not align with their assumptions. The protagonist moved with deliberate calm, yet there was an unmistakable precision in his gaze, a clarity that suggested experience far beyond what the scene implied. It was a small signal, almost imperceptible, but it planted the seed of doubt. He shifted his stance subtly, adjusting his weight with a rhythm learned from years of courtroom observation and professional scrutiny. The officers, focused on protocol and perception, did not immediately recognize it, but the motion carried authority, a controlled command over space that spoke volumes about his inner capacity. Even the crowd, attuned more to spectacle than nuance, caught fleeting glimpses, a tilt of the head, a steady breath that seemed oddly compelling, almost magnetic. His words, calm and measured, contained hints of knowledge that exceeded the immediate situation. Legal terms, references to procedures, and the effortless articulation of complex ideas passed almost unnoticed by some, yet sharp minds within earshot began to register a discord between what they saw and what they heard. The tension was growing not just from the visible confrontation, but from a sense of impending revelation, a quiet promise that the truth would soon emerge in a way impossible to ignore. Even small gestures carried foreshadowing. A subtle nod toward an officer, a carefully placed hand, a deliberate pause in speech, all hinted at control, mastery, and a readiness to assert authority that had not yet been fully recognized. These gestures, though understated, were like breadcrumbs leading to a climactic disclosure, signals that this was no ordinary confrontation and that the assumptions made about him were about to be shattered. The crowd, sensing something extraordinary without fully understanding it, began to lean in metaphorically and literally. Eyes followed his movements more closely, whispers became tentative questions instead of confident judgments, and a tension built that was more than fear. It was anticipation. Even the officers, trained to maintain dominance, felt a subtle unease, a hesitation that suggested their authority might not go unchallenged in ways they had never expected. In this charged atmosphere, foreshadowing worked quietly but powerfully. The scene itself, the flashing lights, murmuring crowd, and heightened awareness was preparing the stage. Every controlled gesture, every precise word, every calm breath signaled that a revelation was imminent. The world around him was unknowingly waiting for a moment that would redefine perception, expose hidden truth, and confront assumptions in the most dramatic and unforgettable way possible. Escalating tension with police and society. The tension thickened, almost tangible, as every second stretched longer than the last. The officer's patience, already strained, began to fray. Hands hovered near holsters, eyes darted with suspicion, and voices took on sharper edges. Every instruction they barked was precise, but their uncertainty betrayed them. They had expected a routine encounter, a suspect who would respond with fear or compliance. Instead, they faced a man whose calm intelligence unsettled them in ways they could not articulate. The crowd, sensing the officer's hesitation, grew restless. Murmurs swelled, shifting from curiosity to speculation. Some whispered theories, while others openly questioned the procedure. "Why aren't they arresting him?" one voice asked. "Something's off," another said, leaning closer to see the subtle expressions on the man's face. Eyes scanned his every movement, trying to reconcile the apparent tension with the incongruity of his calm demeanor. The street felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation. Every gesture the protagonist made seemed to amplify the unease. A slight tilt of the head, a controlled exhale, a measured step. Each movement underscored his awareness, his composure, and his subtle mastery of the unfolding scene. Officers shifted, unsure whether to continue with standard protocol or adjust to the unexpected. Their confidence, built over years of experience, faltered in the presence of someone who challenged assumptions with quiet authority. The public's gaze became more pronounced, oscillating between fear and fascination. Phones recorded every interaction, whispers of judgment mingled with murmurs of doubt. Parents shielded children, unsure how to explain what they were witnessing. Passers-by stopped, sensing that the situation was evolving beyond the ordinary. Every glance, every hesitant gesture from the crowd fed into the tension, creating an atmosphere where anticipation and apprehension collided. A subtle misstep by one officer, a raised hand, a question spoken too quickly, sparked a ripple of uncertainty. The protagonist responded not with aggression, but with calm redirection, precise language, and measured tone. The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks. Even in the crowd, observers sensed the shift. The assumed dominance of authority was being challenged, subtly but undeniably. The night seemed to stretch indefinitely. Sirens cast a flashing rhythm across the scene, shadows flickered across the walls, and the murmurs of the crowd became a living, breathing entity. echoing the suspense that filled the air. Every element, the flashing lights, the murmurs, the officer's uncertainty, the protagonist's quiet control, combined to escalate tension, leaving everyone on edge, waiting for the moment when reality would finally assert itself. The stage was set. Suspicion, authority, bias, and composure collided, and the audience, both on the street and in imagination, held their collective breath. What would happen next was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The story had reached a tipping point, and the suspense was about to explode into revelation. Moments of public humiliation, reinforcing drama. The street had become a theater of humiliation, each passerby a silent or not-so-silent witness to the protagonist's predicament. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every controlled gesture, every patient nod, every compliant movement, yet framing them as proof of guilt. Whispers threaded through the crowd, carrying judgment and assumptions. "Look at him, acting like he's done something wrong," someone muttered, shaking their head. "Why isn't he scared?" another voice asked, dripping with derision. Officers, emboldened by the assumption of authority, gave instructions with increasing force. "Face the wall, hands on your head." The protagonist complied, each action deliberate and precise, yet each obedient movement intensified the spectacle. Every bystander could see him under the harsh glare of streetlights, his dignity under scrutiny, reduced in their eyes to nothing more than a suspect. The juxtaposition of his calm mastery and the crowd's misperception created a tension that was almost unbearable. The murmurs turned into commentary, speculation, and in some cases ridicule. A group of teenagers snickered, whispering about what must have happened to bring this man to such a position. Passers-by shook their heads, some with pity, some with judgment, projecting stories onto him without a single verified fact. Each assumption became a thread in the web of public humiliation, binding him momentarily in a narrative that did not belong to reality. Even small gestures became magnified. A hand raised in explanation, a step forward, a word spoken softly to the officers, each was interpreted through the lens of guilt. The protagonist's composure, his deliberate calm, was twisted in the eyes of onlookers into arrogance or defiance. The irony was sharp and bitter. He was the epitome of control, intellect, and restraint, yet the public perceived only weakness, submission, or possible guilt. At the edges of the crowd, sympathetic glances flickered briefly, but could not penetrate the dominant narrative. The humiliation was visceral, being judged for one's appearance, for assumptions about race, for the mere fact of existing in a moment fraught with bias. Every passing second seemed to stretch the weight of collective misjudgment, amplifying the drama of the moment. Even the officers' insistence on control, their repeated commands, inadvertently reinforced the public spectacle. The more they tried to assert authority, the more visible the protagonist's dignity became in contrast to their misunderstanding. It was a cruel stage, and he was the silent actor enduring scrutiny, yet within that public humiliation lay the seeds of eventual revelation, an inevitable overturning of assumptions that would redefine every judgment made that night. Contrast with judges. Amid the flashing lights, murmuring crowd, and tense officers, the protagonist stood like a pillar of composure. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. He did not flinch, did not argue, did not plead. Instead, he allowed the world to reveal itself through his calm, a quiet demonstration of control that contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. The officers barked commands, the crowd whispered assumptions, yet he remained an island of reason in a storm of misjudgment. His intelligence shone subtly in every word he chose and every gesture he made. When asked a procedural question, he responded not with defiance but with precise clarification, demonstrating knowledge that surpassed expectations. His posture, relaxed yet authoritative, suggested confidence without arrogance. Each nod, each careful adjustment of his stance, conveyed mastery over both his own emotions and the situation, a skill honed through years of study, challenge, and professional experience. Around him, the judges faltered. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing their assumptions might not align with reality. Their commands, once sharp and unyielding, began to falter, replaced by hesitation as they tried to interpret the man's calm authority. The crowd, too, sensed the incongruity. The whispered judgments of moments ago now sounded hollow against the quiet dignity radiating from the protagonist. Some observers shifted uneasily, questioning the certainty with which they had assumed guilt. The contrast could not have been clearer. Here was a man subjected to suspicion, humiliation, and bias, yet his intellect, patience, and poise made him appear more powerful than those who judged him. The very calmness that others had mistaken for weakness became evidence of resilience and mastery. Where the officers and crowd acted on impulse, perception, and bias, he acted on observation, strategy, and understanding. Their reactions were reactive, chaotic. His were measured, intentional. Even the smallest details highlighted this disparity. A precise word in response to a misunderstood instruction, a careful step to maintain spatial awareness, a slight tilt of the head signaling comprehension, all indicated a mind fully in control, a dignity untouched by circumstance. The audience, consciously or not, began to recognize the gap between appearance and reality. The protagonist's composure served as a mirror, reflecting not only his own competence, but the uncertainty and fallibility of those around him. In that moment, the narrative shifted. The man who had been humiliated and misjudged now embodied authority, intellect, and dignity. The contrast between him and his presumptive critics created a tension that was palpable, a suspense that hinted at revelation. It became evident. In a world quick to judge, calm intelligence and unshakable dignity could speak louder than assumptions, prejudice, and noise. Subtle revelations of power and position. Even as the officers maintained a cautious stance, subtle hints began to ripple through the scene, suggesting that the man they confronted was far more than a bystander or suspect. He did not announce his authority. He never needed to. It was present in the careful precision of his language, the weight of his words, and the confidence in his measured responses. Each phrase, though seemingly ordinary, carried a latent power that hinted at experience and influence far beyond what anyone could see. When an officer questioned him, he responded with an ease that suggested deep familiarity with protocol, not just compliance. His explanations were clear, precise, and unexpectedly authoritative, prompting subtle shifts in the officer's expressions. A pause here, a slight nod there, tiny gestures, but enough to plant doubt. The crowd, initially quick to assume guilt, caught glimpses of these signals, though most did not yet comprehend their significance. It was as if reality itself was whispering a secret that only a few could sense. Small, deliberate actions further hinted at his true position. When he adjusted his posture, it was not merely for comfort, it was a controlled statement, an unspoken assertion of presence. When he spoke, even the officers unconsciously leaned in slightly, absorbing information that seemed routine, yet carried the precision of someone accustomed to shaping outcomes. These subtle clues were almost imperceptible, yet they painted a picture of someone whose authority and influence extended far beyond the immediate encounter. The crowd noticed the quiet confidence too. Some observers, attuned to the nuances of body language and tone, sensed that he was more than he appeared. A slight hesitation in an officer's command, a softening of a judgmental glance, hinted that even those trained to assert dominance were beginning to perceive the discrepancy between assumption and reality. Each small revelation created a tension in the air, an almost imperceptible foreshadowing of the truth about to emerge. Even the protagonist's silence spoke volumes. By not asserting his authority overtly, he forced others to confront their assumptions. Every word he spoke, every precise movement served as evidence of competence without declaration. In that way, he controlled the narrative subtly, allowing the world around him to catch glimpses of power and influence without fully grasping it. The tension built quietly, a pressure that promised a dramatic overturning of perception, but only when the right moment arrived. In these fleeting, understated moments, the audience, both the crowd and the officers, began to feel a shift. The man who had seemed ordinary, even vulnerable, now radiated latent authority. The truth remained concealed, but the hints were enough to unsettle assumptions, create doubt, and prepare the stage for a revelation that would not merely surprise, but redefine the way everyone in that street viewed him. Reactions from bystanders and colleagues, heightening mystery. The crowd shifted subtly as more details emerged, or rather as more questions began to surface in their minds. Some observers at the periphery of the scene exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They didn't yet know the truth, but they sensed an incongruity too pronounced to ignore. A passerby who had been watching from a distance whispered to a friend, "There's something different about him. It's like we're seeing only a fraction of the story." The friend nodded, equally unsettled, eyes darting between the protagonist and the officers. Among the crowd, Curiosity grew into speculation. People leaned closer, straining to catch every word, every gesture. Each subtle correction he offered to the officer's commands or procedural missteps was noted, murmured over, and pondered. Some muttered in quiet awe, "He's smart, smarter than anyone expected." Others, less perceptive but equally uneasy, could feel the tension building even if they could not articulate why. The air was thick with the anticipation of revelation. Colleagues, who had happened to arrive coincidentally or been nearby for unrelated reasons, began to recognize certain gestures, certain turns of phrase, a subtle reference, a carefully chosen term. These were the hallmarks of someone they knew from professional circles, yet the protagonist's presence here, under the scrutiny of police and a judgmental crowd, seemed impossible. They exchanged glances, raising silent questions. Could it really be him? And why is he being treated this way? Each unspoken question added layers to the growing mystery. Even those with no connection to him personally found themselves drawn into the tension. Mothers shielding children, teenagers whispering in groups, onlookers who had stopped to watch. They all experienced the same inexplicable tug of curiosity. The disparity between his calm authority and the crowd's initial assumptions created an almost cinematic suspense, one that held everyone in suspended attention. Every small, deliberate action he took only deepened the sense of intrigue. The protagonist, aware of the attention yet unflustered, allowed these reactions to unfold naturally. His silence, his precise movements, his controlled demeanor served to amplify the mystery. The contrast between the growing whispers, the murmured doubts, and his composed presence created a psychological tension that seemed almost palpable. Each observer, consciously or unconsciously, felt they were witnessing something extraordinary, yet they lacked the full context, an anticipation that something monumental was about to surface. In that charged atmosphere, the crowd's collective curiosity became a silent chorus, a tension that threaded through officers, passers-by, and colleagues alike. The mystery was growing, layer by layer, fueled by glimpses of intellect, hints of authority, and a calm that defied expectation. The stage was perfectly set, the world around him poised on the brink of revelation, and the moment when assumptions would collide with reality was drawing closer with each passing second. Audience awaiting the resolution of injustice. The air crackled with anticipation. Every breath, every movement, every whispered comment seemed to amplify the suspense. The crowd had grown silent, the earlier murmurs now replaced by a collective tension that was almost tangible. Mothers held their children a little closer, teenagers leaned forward on tiptoes, and even the officers, normally confident in their authority, hesitated, unsure how to proceed. All eyes were on him, the man who had been misjudged, humiliated, and placed under scrutiny by society and law enforcement alike. The protagonist stood in quiet poise, a calm anchor in the storm of assumptions swirling around him. His gaze scanned the crowd, taking in the faces etched with curiosity, doubt, and unease. He said nothing, allowed nothing to disrupt his composure, and yet every subtle movement carried weight. Each measured step, each tilt of his head, each controlled exhale reinforced a silent message. The truth was coming, and it would shatter the misconceptions that had led to this scene. The officers, caught between protocol and perception, exchanged uneasy glances. One hesitated before giving another command, then paused mid-word, sensing that the situation was no longer straightforward. The once clear distinction between authority and subordination had blurred. The protagonist's calm intelligence and mastery of the moment forced a re-evaluation of assumptions that could no longer be ignored. The tension became almost unbearable, a collective holding of breath as everyone sensed the approaching revelation. Even the crowd, previously quick to judge, felt the weight of suspense. Whispers turned to hesitant observations. "He's different," one murmured. "There's something about him. I don't know what it is," said another. Curiosity mixed with a growing recognition that what they had assumed about him might be entirely wrong. Each observer felt the suspense as a personal tension, an emotional tug between expectation and reality, between judgment and truth. Every detail heightened the climax. The flashing lights cast long, dramatic shadows. The murmurs, though subdued, created a rhythm of tension. The officer's small gestures of hesitation magnified the anticipation. The protagonist's composed stance, calm expression, and deliberate movements stood in stark contrast to the uncertainty and judgment surrounding him. The street had transformed into a stage, each observer, a participant in a shared moment of dramatic suspense, waiting for the long overdue resolution of injustice. Time seemed suspended. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every shifting glance intensified the moment. The audience, both literal and imagined, waited in collective anticipation, fully aware that the truth was imminent. The scene had become more than a confrontation. It was a suspense-filled crucible in which prejudice, authority, and dignity would soon collide, setting the stage for a revelation that no one present would forget. He is the Attorney General. For a tense heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. The crowd, the officers, everyone on that street held their collective breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, the truth began to surface. A document, a badge, a name finally spoken aloud, small tokens of identity that had been hidden beneath years of misjudgment, revealed him for who he truly was. The man who had been humiliated, scrutinized, and doubted was no ordinary citizen. He was the Attorney General. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A mother's hand flew to her mouth. Teenagers stepped back, jaws slack, eyes wide. Whispers became audible exclamations. "No, that can't be him. He's the Attorney General?" Even the officers faltered, their confidence shattered in an instant. Those who had assumed authority and control now faced the dissonance between expectation and reality. The carefully constructed narrative of guilt dissolved, replaced by the undeniable weight of truth. The protagonist remained calm, almost serene. He did not boast, did not lecture, and did not demand recognition. Instead, his composed demeanor amplified the revelation. The contrast between the unjust assumptions and the reality of his position created a palpable shockwave of awe and guilt. Those who had judged him, officers, bystanders, colleagues, strangers, now had to reconcile the enormity of their error with the quiet authority of the man before them. Officers lowered their voices, exchanged sheepish glances, and muttered apologies under their breath. The commands that had been barked so confidently moments before seemed absurd now. The realization dawned: they had treated one of the highest-ranking legal authorities in the country as a suspect. The weight of their mistake pressed upon them. A mix of embarrassment, disbelief, and the bitter taste of prejudice confronted head-on. The crowd's energy shifted, a collective movement from judgment to astonishment. Every whisper, every stare, every hesitant step reflected the collision of perception and reality. People who had mocked, gawked, or judged now experienced a powerful, almost cinematic reversal. They saw not a suspect, but a figure of profound authority, intellect, and influence, whose calm had concealed decades of achievement and power. In this single, explosive moment, every assumption crumbled. The Attorney General, humble in demeanor yet commanding in presence, stood revealed, a living embodiment of dignity, intelligence, and the danger of judging by appearance alone. The city street, once a stage of humiliation, had become a theater of revelation. Everyone present, from the crowd to the officers, would carry the memory of this reversal, the humbling lesson of misjudgment, and the undeniable truth of his extraordinary position. Documents, office, official recognition. Once the revelation settled over the street, the scene began to transform from chaos into recognition. The protagonist's identity as the Attorney General was no longer just whispered speculation, it was undeniable. Officers, previously commanding and suspicious, now stood uncertainly, deferring with subtle gestures that acknowledged his authority. Even the crowd, still processing the shock, gave him space, their stares shifting from judgment to awe. He calmly reached for documents, folders embossed with official seals that confirmed his position. The badges, credentials, and official letters were not brandished arrogantly. Instead, they were presented with quiet dignity, each item a testament to years of professional achievement. Every document reinforced his authority, not through showmanship, but by providing irrefutable proof of the power and responsibility he carried. The street, once a theater of humiliation, became a display of legitimacy and respect. The officers, now fully aware of their mistake, stepped back, their postures straightening as a mixture of embarrassment and acknowledgement settled over them. They had enforced authority, but the true authority had been standing calmly all along, guiding every interaction through composure, intelligence, and expertise. The contrast was stark. Those who assumed control were suddenly humbled, while the protagonist's silent confidence commanded the respect that words alone could not convey. As he directed attention to his office, a space meticulously arranged and clearly a hub of power, the gravity of his position became even more apparent. Bookshelves lined with legal texts, framed awards, and personal achievements told a story of dedication, intellect, and influence. The environment reflected not just authority, but the careful cultivation of knowledge and responsibility, underscoring the depth of the accomplishments that had gone unnoticed by so many. Recognition extended beyond documentation and space. Colleagues arrived, acknowledging him with nods and murmured greetings, their respect evident in every gesture. Even the public sensed the shift. Murmurs of, "He is important, he really is important," spread through the crowd, and phones that had once captured moments of perceived humiliation now recorded a living testament to integrity, competence, and respect. Every acknowledgement, every subtle deference emphasized the truth of his role and the respect it commanded. In these moments, the protagonist's authority was undeniable, yet understated. He did not need to dominate the scene with arrogance. His identity, his accomplishments, and the reverent recognition of others spoke louder than any assertion. The blend of official documents, the weight of his office, and the respectful acknowledgement of those around him transformed the street from a site of public humiliation into a stage of vindication, demonstrating that true authority requires not intimidation, but mastery, composure, and the quiet power of earned respect. Irony and social reflection. The street was silent, yet alive with the hum of realization. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air. A man publicly humiliated, scrutinized, and judged purely on appearance and assumptions turned out to be one of the most powerful legal authorities in the country. Officers who had acted with confidence now stood frozen, caught in the tension between authority and error. The crowd, once quick to judge, was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their assumptions had been not only wrong, but deeply misplaced. Whispers of astonishment rippled through bystanders. He's the Attorney General?" one voice murmured, disbelief lacing every syllable. "All this time we were wrong," said another, shaking their head. The irony was bitter and undeniable. The very people who had assumed guilt, who had derived a sense of moral superiority from observation and prejudice, now faced the stark contrast between perception and reality. Judgment, based solely on bias, had failed spectacularly. The protagonist's calm, composed demeanor only magnified the contrast. He did not gloat, did not mock, and did not demand apologies. His quiet authority spoke louder than any accusation or defense could. Every gesture, every carefully chosen word reinforced the lesson. Assumptions based on race, appearance, or incomplete information could never withstand the weight of truth and competence. The public humiliation, once sharp and personal, had been transformed into a profound social commentary. Even the officers who had initially treated him as a suspect now grappled with their own biases. The recognition of error was humbling, the realization that authority and intelligence could be invisible when judged by appearance alone forced an internal reckoning. Some officers exchanged embarrassed glances, while others muttered apologies, their voices carrying both sincerity and shame. The situation served as a stark reminder that authority is not always visible, and that prejudice can blind even the most trained eyes. The crowd, too, reflected the broader societal lesson. Mothers, teenagers, and passers-by all began to murmur about assumptions, judgment, and the dangers of superficial assessment. Conversations shifted from gossip to reflection, from speculation to contemplation. The irony of the situation, humiliation leading to revelation, underscored the pervasive influence of bias, the fragility of perception, and the importance of patience, observation, and humility. In that charged moment, the street became a microcosm of society itself, a place where misjudgment and prejudice could collide with truth and dignity, resulting in a dramatic but instructive reversal. The revelation left everyone with a lasting impression, a lesson in humility, fairness, and the profound consequences of judging too quickly. The narrative had shifted, the tension resolved, and the world around the protagonist now recognized a truth that had long been hidden behind assumptions and appearances. Overcoming, patience, and transforming indignation into learning. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance, the protagonist stood alone for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just occurred. The public humiliation, the whispers, the judgments, all of it now seemed part of a distant, almost surreal memory. He allowed himself a deep, steady breath, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had little to do with recognition and everything to do with patience, perseverance, and the quiet triumph of integrity. He reflected on the long journey that had led to this moment. Years of dedication, sleepless nights of study, challenges faced in a world that often measured worth by appearance rather than ability, all had culminated in a quiet but undeniable authority. Each insult, each misunderstanding, each instance of bias he had endured had been a lesson in patience. What could have bred bitterness instead became fuel for growth, shaping him into someone capable of facing adversity with composure and intelligence. Indignation lingered, of course, the sting of assumptions, the injustice of being judged by race and appearance, but it was tempered by understanding. He realized that anger, when harnessed, could become motivation. The frustration he had once felt toward society's misjudgments was now transformed into an appreciation of resilience, the value of self-control, and the power of silent competence. Every moment of humiliation had become an opportunity to demonstrate through action rather than words the strength of character and intellect. In this quiet reflection, he also considered the broader implications. The incident had been more than a personal ordeal. It was a microcosm of societal assumptions and the dangers of superficial judgment. He understood that patience and measured action were not just personal virtues, but tools for navigating and influencing a world that often misreads appearances. His experience had become a lesson in the subtle yet profound impact of perseverance, dignity, and strategic self-restraint. The protagonist allowed a small, knowing smile to cross his face. He had endured scrutiny, bias, and humiliation, yet he had emerged unbroken, his authority intact and his dignity unshaken. Each challenge he had faced had contributed to a mastery of self that could not be taken away. The indignation that might have consumed him was now a quiet power, transformed into wisdom and patience. As he turned toward his car, the city lights reflecting softly on the pavement, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ordeal had reaffirmed his belief that true authority lies not in force or visibility, but in competence, composure, and the courage to remain oneself in the face of prejudice. He had converted humiliation into insight, bias into understanding, and indignation into measured strength, a lesson he carried forward, silently, powerfully, and irrevocably. Impactful conclusion. As the night settled over the city, the street, once a stage for humiliation and misunderstanding, now felt transformed. What had begun as a scene of prejudice, misjudgment, and tension had evolved into a story of revelation, dignity, and reflection. The protagonist's quiet mastery, patience, and composure had not only unveiled the truth of his extraordinary position, but also illuminated the dangers of assumptions based on race, appearance, or societal bias. Observers carried the memory of the night long after the lights faded. For some, it was a lesson in humility, an undeniable reminder that the human mind is too often quick to judge, too eager to define someone by incomplete perception. For others, it was a call to recognize the power of patience and composure, to understand that true authority does not shout, but commands quietly through competence, wisdom, and integrity. The crowd's astonishment was mirrored in the officers' reflection, as each considered the mistakes made and the biases exposed. It was a collective awakening, a moment that lingered far beyond the immediate drama. The story of this encounter, though extraordinary, carried a universal truth. It reminded society that talent, authority, and achievement often remain invisible behind the masks imposed by prejudice. It emphasized the value of patience and understanding, the importance of withholding judgment until the full story is known, and most importantly, it highlighted the profound consequences of misjudgment, both personal and societal, showing how assumptions, however unconscious, can perpetuate injustice and undermine the dignity of individuals. For the protagonist, the night's events reinforced lessons long learned: the strength of composure under scrutiny, the power of knowledge applied with humility, and the resilience born from facing bias and adversity. What others perceived as vulnerability or weakness had been, in truth, preparation, years of cultivating self-mastery, intellect, and ethical authority that no public spectacle could diminish. His journey, marked by challenges, patience, and steadfast resolve, had come to symbolize the quiet triumph of integrity over assumption. As he walked away from the street, leaving the murmuring crowd and reflective officers behind, a sense of closure settled. The city had witnessed more than a confrontation. It had witnessed a reversal of perception, a lesson in justice, and a reminder of humanity's capacity for both error and understanding. The incident would resonate as a story of empowerment, resilience, and social insight, a narrative that challenged prejudice, honored dignity, and left a lasting impact on everyone who bore witness. In the end, the message was clear. True authority and human worth cannot be measured by appearances. They are revealed through patience, perseverance, and integrity, and sometimes it takes a dramatic encounter, a moment of tension and revelation, to remind the world of that undeniable truth. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share it with your friends. And I'm curious, on a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Drop your score in the comments below.